Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Usher, and this is the World of Higher Education podcast. One of the consequences of Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been a vast reconfiguring of Russia's academic and intellectual life. Universities, thought of as a potential hotbed of opposition since the White Ribbon Movement of 2011, came under intense control, and its personnel placed under even greater scrutiny. Many faculty fled. Connections with international partners in the West were severed. And then to top it off, the Russian government announced that it would abandon the 3-degree bachelor's, master's, doctoral system introduced when the country joined the Bologna Process 20 years earlier. All this has combined to create what some have called a slow motion collapse in Russian higher education. But to understand what's been happening in Russian universities since February 2022, you really need to go back to the dawn of the Putin era in January 2000 and understand how ideological control of institutions has come to rest squarely inside the Kremlin. Joining the podcast today is Dmitry Dubrovsky. He's a scholar at the Institute for International Studies at Charles University in Prague, where he's taught ever since being designated as a foreign agent by the Putin regime in early 2022. And he writes primarily about the politics of academic freedom and civil society in Russia. He's with us today to talk about this slow motion collapse, the internal governance of Russian institutions, and how the country might one day be put back on a track to integration with European academia. Over to Dmitry. Dmitry, I want to take us back to the year 2000. Vladimir Putin is the new president of the Russian Federation. What was the state of the higher education sector at the time, and how did Putin approach the sector? How did he view higher education as an instrument of state policy?
Well, the legacy of 90s. Putin faced a serious challenge, actually. What he'd have that serious problem of the underfunding and fragmented higher education, with the at the same time, the scholars eager to join the European system. There was a lot of the attempt in the 90s, but so the biggest problem was the lack of finance, a lack of international mechanism, international tools to join the European system of the higher education and science. And that is why the Putin sees first and foremost the higher education science as a tool to join Europe, to become the member of the European family, to become the prominent member of the global market of ideas. And that is why Russia joined Bologna Process in 2003 and very actively pushed internationalization.
And so in that sense, it's not that different from most other countries in the former socialist bloc, Poland or Romania, the idea that internationalization would bring about an improvement of higher education. Is that about right?
It's right, but this very important difference, we believe it was small, but it became a very serious issue in the very end. I think that always in the, let's say, the world of the higher education and science, always everywhere. We do exist the people who would believe that our system is much advanced.
Right.
Our science is top on the top, crème de la crème. The problem with the late Soviet Union and Russian Federation, that was the substantial amount of people who survived the collapse of Soviet Union believing that Russian and Soviet science is the most advanced in the world. For some sense, for the different directions in the different disciplines, it could be true. But for the most of the, for example, humanities and social sciences, that wasn't true. And for the late 90s especially, it was the substantial amount of people who had been seriously disappointed of the result of the democratic reforms and seriously disappointed of the result of democratic rules in the country and in the higher education science as well.
Okay. Now, Putin was president until 2008, and then he switched places for 4 years with Prime Minister Medvedev, and he returns to power as president in 2012. And it's as you say, it's a different Putin. It's a much more authoritarian Putin. How did his approach to higher education change? If you had this, Putin, 1.0 in the year 2000 and 2.0 around 2012, how does it change? How does he try to exert greater control over the system?
What important to say before the Putin came back to power, it was very important time, especially in the Medvedev time, when for this more or less 2007, 2008, mostly for the Medvedev term. It was the very serious time of the reforms of the Russian higher education. And these reforms mostly intended to improve the quality of higher education and its international recognition.
Mhm.
And that was the time of so-called managerialist modernization. From the beginning, it was the idea we should select the flagship universities,
Mhm.
which will drive the other universities ahead of the, bright future of the higher
Right.
education
It,
in
it
Russia.
eventually that becomes the 5-100 project.
500 2020,
Yeah.
meaning at least 5 Russian universities should be listed in the world rankings universities to 2020. And that was the very interesting time because it was the time of the serious transformation of the social cultural landscape within the Russian higher education. Because the so-called effective manager came into the system of higher education. This was the time when the higher education became the serious investigation. They received the serious donation, serious investment from the state. And that's become very attractive, first and foremost, for the new managers and new managerial approach to the higher education and science. And that is the interesting time when the internationalization went hand to hand with serious growing of the managerial control of the Russian universities. And that is the time, even before the Putin came to power, the higher education became the very interesting tool for the demonstration of the effectiveness of the Russian politics, and become the Russia already started to check whether it's possible to use the Russian higher education as the soft power, creating or continuing to support the Russian universities in the former Soviet countries like Armenia, Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, and so on. And
Okay.
that is the time before the Putin came to power. When the Putin came to power, the situation changed dramatically because I'm calling a conservative shift. That was not a conservative shift in the politics. It was a conservative shift in the higher education and science, mostly concerned with the serious change of the politics within the country.
And some of that has to do, like I remember at the time, there was a lot of crackdown on foreign organizations. So a lot of the international cooperation became tougher. There were attacks on Soros. In social sciences and humanities, there was a crackdown on things like gender studies and spaces for LGBTQ students. And Masha Gessen wrote about that in her book, The Future is History. Why did that happen at that time? Like, what was it about Putin that he said, this is an area that I want to control in a much more, as you say, and push it in a more conservative direction?
Well, first and foremost, let me remind you that was the protests of the 2011, 2012.
Right.
That was the time of the wide-driven, I would say, situation or action which was very close to the revolution, but this revolution never happened. We failed, actually, because I also was a member of this movement. We failed. And the very important participation of scholars and students in this event made the higher education in the field of the special control from the security service, from the political apparatus, first. And second, they truly believe that their control under the system of education will return them the legitimacy and, let's say, the symbolical power in the society.
Okay.
Just well, again, so they're more or less Soviet people. They truly believe, oh, that's how the Soviet Union ruled. Soviet Union ruled because of control, in particular, the higher education and the political control, ideological control. It was true in a certain way, right? So that's how the Soviet Union restored or configure all this its power through in particular, through the system of higher education, through the university. And that is how the Putin believed that would be possible to restore and strengthen his government, which was in a certain way undermined the event of the 2011, 2012.
Right. And so we've been talking, I guess, I mean, the way we've been framing this has been a relationship between institutions and the government. But the government changed the way institutions were run a couple of times, right? So how has the exercise of power within Russian universities changed? And is the process, I'm pretty sure there's been a change in the process of selecting university leaders. How has that changed Putin's ability to control universities?
Well, the specificity of the Russian universities in general always been in 90s. It was absolutely enormous amount of democracy. Seriously, there was absolutely no money in it. So it was the extremely poor. But at the same time, it was let's say, the poor democracy in the way that it was the numerous elections and the whole the system of the levels of the university. On the university government was very active self-governance. It was a very active, political struggle the people were fighting for the position of dean. They competed each other on the position of rector. So that was the numerous even chair. So there's almost every position, administrative position within the Russian university could be elected. So they could have this system of election. When the Putin came to power, especially in the time of the managerial reforms, it was the kind of exchange. It was the pressure especially for this flagship 500 2020 project to change, to correct the university charter and to replace the election to the assignment from the government. Official explanation was very simple. You will have so many, the state budget. We have additional control on the state budget. Therefore, we should assign the rector, but not elected this position. And till now, honestly, substantial amount of the Russian rectors are still elected, but in Putin's Russia, election is not election as a normal understanding of it. That's why the ministry is proposing the candidacy and the people voting, and this is more or less looks like the election of the Putin.
Dmitry, in the early days of the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, I think one thing that surprised a lot of people in the West, it just seemed to come out of the blue, was a letter in support of the invasion that was signed by, I've forgotten the number, several hundred university rectors. Why did they do that? I mean, presumably they were ordered to do it by Putin, but why did Putin think that particularly would be legitimizing?
Again, the post-Soviet societies, they have a very high trust into their higher education science. And the leaders of the higher education should officially support their so-called hard decision about the war. Mm-hmm. But what is important to remember, this is unfortunately some of our colleagues in the world, I'm afraid, forgot about this simple fact I already mentioned. Mm-hmm. Most of these rectors never been democratically elected. So they are not representing the voices of the Russian scholars or lecturers, mm-hmm. the faculty members. They are mostly representing the wish of the presidential administration to collect the number of names into the list of support and then move to this shameful document. And of course, previously, well, I already mentioned it, but let me repeat it again. So because the foreign agent law in 2015, so it was the beginning of the anti-Western paranoia for the very long time. Yeah, it was the beginning of the idea of to search let's say the American groups of influence, of the cut their connections with the international centers, to declare the Central European University, for example, as an undesirable organization, and or Bard College of New York, undesirable organization. So that is the long story of the fear and anxiety to send to the leaders of the higher education, and of course, that was the direct blackmail, because if you and this is, that is the very serious bargain. If you decided not to sign it, okay, so this is your choice. But think about your faculty members. Right. Think about the group of the team of the colleagues you have collected, you invited. They will be probably fired soon.
What changed on university campuses after the invasion? I mean, I would imagine, obviously, you'd be, if I were in Putin's position, I would be worried about student unrest. So, what happened in terms of surveillance on campus, and how did faculty react? I mean, you were a faculty member at the time, and you're one of many, I think, who left fairly quickly after the invasion. Like, how big a brain drain was there after this?
Well, not so big for different reasons. Just imagine, but the academics, they cannot move like other people. They should move, having in mind as any possible way to continue working. But that's not the case. So for the substantial amount of people, so there isn't simply no place to be settled very quickly at least. So Well, my personal story was different because I was just coincident. I have the invitation. I've got the invitation to spend the time in fellowship. And the long story short, I was quickly relocated from St. Petersburg, my home city, to Prague.
Mm.
But for a substantial amount of the people, they left. And when it comes to institutional surveillance, yes, that was it looks like Russia prepared to the war approximately 2 years before.
Right.
Because the 2 years before, in 2020, already they started to introduce for example, special vice rector responsible for the youth, literally just for the surveillance, to control their loyalty. At the same time, it was established the special institutions with actually very long title. It's of these departments within the Russian universities called promoting the civil consciousness, preventing extremism and inter-ethnic relations. But in the nutshell, this is the institutions embodied in the higher education to control and discipline Russian students and scholars. Because in reality, what they're doing, they're searching the social network, looking for let's say, the betrayal behavior of the Russian scholars and students, and reporting into the security service and police department. And this currently, that's almost each subject of Russian Federation had such one department for the whole subject to report such kind of improper behavior.
After that rector's letter, Russia was suspended from the Bologna process. And in retaliation, Putin announced a return to the pre-Bologna system. So we're getting rid of the bachelor's, master's, PhD. We're bringing back the second PhD that used to be there in the Russian system. How is this process unfolding? How easy is it to undo Bologna?
That's a good question. Indeed, I don't think the Russia is really supposed to undo Bologna. And the Russia is not going to make a reverse plan. I mean, that's certainly not idea to recreate the Soviet path. No. Honestly, so my impression of this, from the one side, that is the direct pressure to the Ministry of Higher Education and to the bureaucrats within the ministry to change dramatically the system which had been created for 20 up years. And this system cannot be reversed in the second.
Mm-hmm.
And that cannot stop. I mean, even legally, if you already hired the students, or you invite the students to study this particular subject, follow this program, you should stop it. It is 5 years. I mean, 4 years at least. Yeah. In 4 years, you can change it, but certainly not for the moment. And secondly, so I'm always thinking that is the certain, for me, it sounds like the idea of the mimicking and emulation from the post-Soviet bureaucratic in circles in the higher education, because it looks like, because I'm following what's going on in the Russian higher education, in the statement of the Minister of Education, and they always try to explain what would be different, but they can't, because they have literally no clue what they should do.
Mm-hmm.
They officially should have the kind of different, that is not Bologna system anymore. It's proved to be ineffective, but now we will have something which will collect the best achievement of the Russian system of education. For God's sake, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? So that's absolutely impossible. What they mean, and they trying to rather sabotage it, from my perspective, rather to just to move something substantial.
Looking ahead, what do you think a post-Putin higher education system in Russia might look like? Is there a path back into the European higher education space? And what does it take to undo the damage that's been done since 2012?
It is a good question. Currently, we have the situation what I would call the forced deglobalization. So we literally went back to the situation before the 2003. It doesn't mean, substantial amount of the faculty members who currently work in Russian system of higher education and science, they went through the Western institutions, they've got the Western degrees, and that is still the substantial capacity the Russian system has. At the same time, the fate of the Russian system is, of course, that's very difficult. It's very difficult to predict, because it's very seriously tied with the fate of the Russian Federation in general. From the political perspective, if we will have the decreasing of the sanctions and somehow the end of the war, and maybe that's more or less come back to the what we would call normalcy. So that's is also very disputable what we would call normalcy in the moment. But I would say that that will be rather close to the situation of the Cold War, and rather close to the 70s, after second half of 70s, if I could compare to the situation. More or less, but they're very serious restrictions, because there is this already serious sanctions imposed. Substantial amount of the institutions and countries impose the academic sanctions, academic boycotts. We have the substantial sanctions, which is seriously restricted the Russia against the development of the any visible contacts or academic exchange with the European countries. And Russia is turning to the other countries. Russia is turning to the alternative globalization. Russia is moving to join the China, Iran, South Africa, and Brazil within the frame of the so-called BRICS cooperation.
Yeah. Well, Dmitry, thank you so much for being with us today. And it just remains for me to thank our excellent producers, Sam Pufik and Tiffany McLennan, and you, our readers and listeners, for joining us. If you have any questions or comments on this week's episode or suggestions for future ones, please don't hesitate to get in touch at podcast@higheredstrategy.com. Join us next week when our guest will be Joshua Travis Brown from Johns Hopkins University School of Education. He'll be joining us to talk about his fascinating new book from Oxford University Press entitled Capitalizing on College: How Higher Education Went from Mission-Driven to Margin-Obsessed. Bye for now.